Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Looking for ways to help your clients become less susceptible to market fluctuations and peer influence? Get powerful personalization for every investor with Orion Custom Indexing, our tech-enabled solution for managing tax-efficient, customized portfolios at scale. Learn more at orion.com/custom indexing.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I am your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and we're here today on an all ATL edition of the show. I'm joined by Jay Coulter, who is the founder of the Resilient Companies, which includes a consulting firm, an RIA, Resilient Wealth, and a media company, Resilient Digital Media, that produces Financial Advisor TV. He is the host of the Resilient Advisor podcast and author of The Resilient Advisor. He has two children who he has raised to be undoubtedly resilient young people, and holds CFP and SEMA designations, as well as an MBA from one of my own alma maters, Emory University. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's a little obnoxious, isn't it, with all the resilience?
No, it's brand consistency. It's brand consistency. Here I am drinking a Coke Zero, and here you are naming everything resilient.
That's right.
Keeping it brand consistent. How are you, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you had me on ages ago, and I've been meaning to reciprocate, and I haven't gotten around to it. But here we are on our all ATL edition. So glad to have you here to talk about the human side of advisor coaching today and how simple systems and processes can make your business more resilient, of course, and can free you up to do the important human stuff that we all care so much about, right? So what's your story? Like, how did you get into advisor coaching?
Yeah, so a long story, really short. I spent most of my career in asset management. I was at Lehman Brothers when they went down. And then I found myself at an investment firm where I was hired to be a portfolio specialist and found myself in the role of a mutual fund wholesaler. And Daniel, I wasn't a very good mutual fund wholesaler. So they gave me an opportunity to look for work elsewhere. And because I didn't know what to do, I just started a consulting business.
Within the organization, or you broke out immediately?
Oh, they gave me the opportunity to break out.
The opportunity to break out. And look, we're going to talk about euphemistic speech today and casting everything in a positive light. They gave you the opportunity to break out. I really like that. So I got a story, if you'll permit a small digression that will lead us into sort of the meat of our conversation. There is a psychologist from the Deep South, like myself, and he's sort of a sports psychologist, also works with a lot of folks, especially in the wirehouse world. I won't name names, but people can probably figure it out, right? So he's worked with Alabama, like he's worked with Nick Saban. He's got this awesome sort of pedigree. He speaks kind of like a Southern preacher, really like super engaging speaker. And so when I was a young, consultant, public speaker, psychologist guy, I go to his presentation. He was presenting to my dad's firm, Morgan Stanley, and I knew how much he was getting paid. And this was a multiple of what I was getting paid at the time. And so he probably had 20 years on me. So I came up to him afterwards and I said, sir, great job. Enjoyed the speech. I got to ask you a question. Like, we have, basically the same pedigree, like educationally, like we come from the same world. And yet here you are charging 10 times, what I'm charging. What is your secret? And he handed me a card with a little pyramid, kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy type thing. And it had like, I can't remember, 3 or 4 different levels on it. And it was sort of his model for human growth. And he said, this is the difference. I've got a system and you don't. And it was really kind of brilliant. And I actually really appreciate him for, talking to a punk kid and giving me that good advice, because there really is something powerful about systematizing and codifying something as abstract as the world we work in of human behavior. All of this is a long-winded way of saying, you've got to model yourself, right? You've got these 5 different coaching domains that you use to help advisors. What are they, and how did you arrive at your 5?
Yeah, so when I started consulting after being given that opportunity to go do it, my thesis was that I would help advisors build their investment systems. That's my background, it was my passion. We were successful at onboarding clients, but Daniel, what I figured out really quickly is their investment system was probably the least of their problems. And because of that, I expanded it into a full practice management program. And they're all based upon 5 different domains, 5 different systems. And I customize it for each advisor or firm I work with, because I found that a templated approach didn't work and enabled us to customize it to what they were trying to accomplish.
Very cool. So what are the different domains? What are the different domains you look at and that you tweak for each client?
Yep. All right. So first 3 are the technical domains: a client communication system, a wealth management system, which includes your investment process and your financial planning process, and then a business development system. But more germane to your audience and what we're talking about, on the human side, I teach something we call the protocol system, and then we teach a leadership and accountability system.
Protocol system and a leadership and accountability system. So I got to be honest, the leadership and accountability piece makes at least some intuitive sense to me. Protocol system, I've got nothing. Help me out. What is the protocol system?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you letting me share this. I'd like to start with a story. So in 2009, I found myself in a really bad spot. Lehman Brothers had gone down. I had a daughter who's perfectly healthy today, but she was born 10 weeks early. She weighed less than 2 pounds. I had a tremendous amount of stress in my life. And as somebody in his mid-30s, I processed that the way somebody processed it back then. I kept it all inside. And it built up and built up. And of course, I didn't talk to anybody about it. And it led me to a place where I was becoming physically ill. Daniel, I couldn't walk straight. I couldn't lift my arms above my head. I couldn't think. I had all the signs of what we now today know as depression. I didn't even put that in the realm of possibility. I thought I was sick and going to die. And so I go to a doctor, and I'm very embarrassed by this story. I go to a doctor and I said, tell him all of my symptoms, all the problems I'm having. And he said, all right, Jay, we're going to do a full battery workup of blood work. It's probably going to come back negative because you're 35 years old. And then we need to talk about you struggling with depression. Daniel, I got off the little examination table. I put my finger in his face and I said, in the third person, with all the arrogance in the world, Jay Coulter doesn't get depressed. And I left his office. Didn't even pay, just walked right out. But I went to the library, and because I'm a voracious researcher, I started studying depression and anxiety, and it's like I was reading books about myself. And I would just sit there and, quite frankly, start crying, reading about what I had been dealing with and keeping inside. But I was an American male, and it was 2009, and I sure wasn't going to tell anybody, and I sure was not going to get any help. So I self-diagnosed. My wife was the only person who knew what I was dealing with, and eventually, over a couple of years, I found a way to get myself better. But because we know the statistics, 1 in 4 people struggle with anxiety or depression to an extreme level. I started to be able to notice it in my friends, in my family, in financial advisors that I was working with. But I still kind of kept it all to myself. And then I noticed it in my best friend. This is somebody who, we ran around with in our 20s, big old 6'5", walk-on football player at a D1 school who, in his mid-30s, started smoking, lost a bunch of weight, was having stress at work. And I thought, I know what he's going through. He doesn't know what he's going through, but we're American males. It's 2010. I'm not going to talk to him about this. But it got really bad. So Daniel, I made the decision that I needed to tell him my story. And I told him a longer version of what I just shared with you. And that big old dude just started crying. And we talked through what I had done. We got him professional help, which everybody needs to get. Went and saw his regular doctor, psychiatrist, after about 1.5 years, doing so much better. He was doing great. In fact, we were at his annual Christmas party, and all our old buddies from our youth were there, and he motioned over to them, and he said, Jay, if all those guys knew the stuff you and I talked about, they'd really laugh at us and give us a hard time. 3 months later, he sold his business to the Carlyle Group, and a man with 3 kids under the age of 5 who just became a multimillionaire, took his own life. After he did that, and we got past the shock of it, I decided that I needed to kind of come public with what I struggled with, because I noticed it in other people. I noticed it in advisors that I was working with as well. So my wife and I started, because you still didn't talk about this as an American male back then, we started a platform called Conquer Worry, so I didn't have to put my face on it. It was a podcast, very popular podcast, because a lot of people were searching for help and resources, because back then people didn't talk about these struggles. Wrote a book that we were particularly proud of because it laid out the systems that I used in my research to go and find ways to get better. And that book is a poorly written book, but has great systems in it. We've been able to sell that on 4 different continents. And then a blog, which I've stepped away from all that over the last 5 years. But what I found in my consulting business is the advisors I was working with struggled at a rate higher than the 25% we know today of people who struggle with depression and anxiety. And it was extreme. So I took the framework from that program, Conquer Worry, and I put it in a book, and I made it look like a business book. And that's what the Resilient Advisor is. Customized it for financial advisors. And what I have found is that when I work with advisors who are struggling and they're willing to talk about it, I can get them to go get professional help and start rebuilding their life. And I'll wrap it up with a story that I tell any advisor that opens up to me about their struggles. It's an old story that Earl Nightingale used to tell. And if you can imagine a dad coming home from work in the 1950s, sitting in his chair, and his son coming up to him and saying, "Dad, let's go have a catch." And he's tired. And he wants a minute to read the newspaper. He takes a page out of the newspaper. It's a map of the world, tears it into a bunch of pieces, puts it on the coffee table. And he said, "Son, we'll go have a catch after you build this puzzle." He goes back to his newspaper. In very short order, the boy says, "Dad, I'm done." And he looks down in amazement as he's built this map of the world. And the dad said, "Son, how did you do that?" And he said, "Dad, it was easy. We have a glass coffee table. I just went underneath the coffee table because there was a picture of a man on the other side. And if you put the man together, you put the world together." And Daniel, that's where most people who are struggling need to really focus before they worry about their investment systems, their business development systems. They got to take care of themselves first.
There's so much truth in that last piece that you just shared. I'm first of all so thankful for your willingness to talk about these things now. What was it? And you don't have to go into any detail that you don't deem necessary, but what was it that allowed you to put yourself back together, put the man back together?
Yeah. So in that book, which by the way, I give it away. If you go to Resilient Advisor, you can download the book. I did research in really a couple of different domains. Positive psychology was one of them, emotional intelligence, and then physiological science, diet and exercise. And I went and found different tools that other people had used, and I tried everything I could. So some work for some people, some work for others, and then we put them into what we call a protocol system, things that you need to do on a daily basis. Now, protocol is a common word, but I actually stole this from a woman named Shamiqua Holdsclaw, who was the number 1 pick in the WNBA draft in 1997, I believe. In fact, there was even talk back then she was so good that she should play in the NBA. But her whole life fell apart because of a struggle with mental health. And today, she is one of the biggest advocates in the world for mental health. And she told me, she said, "Jay, I have to have a daily protocol system." That's when the light bulb went off. And I was like, all right, this is how we frame it. And so to answer your question, mine are really simple. I eat really, really healthy. I exercise every single day. And then I have a couple of others that I lean into if I ever do find myself struggling. One is journaling daily, not about my feelings, but about what's going on in business. I find that personally helps me. Other people benefit from journaling about themselves. And as crazy as it sounds, like meditation helps me when I'm struggling a lot. And I struggled with meditation for years and years. And then I read that Ray Dalio and Arnold Schwarzenegger both attribute meditation to their success. And Arnold's was specifically when he was training for Mr. Olympia in the 70s. So I said, all right, if these guys can do it, I can try it. So I'm going to do it for 10 days. And it was 9 days of me beating myself up in my own mind. And at the end of the 9th day, Daniel, I thought, God, I only have to do this one more day. And then I'm putting this protocol to the side. I never have to do it again. And at the end of the 10th day, I had this amazing sense of calm after I had gone through it. So that's a go-to resource for me as well.
You know, the other thing that I appreciate so much about your own story that I've seen in my own life is that, you know, even for me, Like I consider, for crying out loud, I'm a psychologist, right? Like I should be comfortable talking about my feelings. I'm mental health positive. I'm therapy positive. I'm all these things. But yet I find for myself, I'm still an American male. And I find for myself, though, that physical symptoms are almost always the canary in the coal mine. For me, it's almost always sleep or back pain or, something like that. That is the early, the check engine light for my mental health. So I think that's something, a quarter of all visits to a general practitioner end in a referral to a mental health professional. Because people like you, right? Like just like with your story, you go in with these, I can't raise my arms, I can't, I'm having all these symptoms, and you think you have, a brain tumor or something, and you're just sad. And so I think that, for the men and, and the women on the call, that's something to keep out for, is what is your check engine light? What is that early warning system for you? Because even those of us who, perhaps on the surface would say we're more comfortable talking about these things, we still live in a society where we are told to push past it, to keep working, keep your head down. You got kids to support, a family to support. This is embarrassing. We don't talk about this, whatever it is. And you really, really have to figure out what that looks like for you.
And I would add, get professional help. That's the mistake I made. I tried to do it on my own, and I was fortunate. It led to a good outcome over time. When people reach out to me, it goes something like this. It says, "Hey, Jay," and I assume we're going to talk about investments or or how to optimize their financial planning system. And they'll say, "Yeah, Jay, I read your book." And then I know where that conversation is going. And it always ends with me suggesting strongly that they go get professional help.
Right. So start with yourself, set these protocols in place to make sure that your personal house is in order. And then that allows us presumably to move to the second human coaching domain, which is leadership and accountability. Talk to us about that.
Isn't that a nice fancy term that a consultant or coach would use? Leadership and accountability. At the end of the day, it's just goals and goal setting in a fancy framework. I used to, at the beginning of an engagement or when somebody was doing due diligence and coming through my program, I would say, "Hey, could I see a list of your goals?" And they'd say, "No, I don't have it." And I say, "Well, does your assistant have it? Does your team have it? Is it at home?" And of course, most people don't have a good set of goals. This is usually the last domain that I would work with a financial advisor on after we've gone through the technical domains and a protocol system if it was appropriate for them. But I'm moving it to the top of the list, Daniel. And if you could humor me for another story as to why I'm doing that. So last year, I had a growth on my face, and it started growing in January. And by the end of December, it was about the size of a golf ball. And the good wife said, "Jay, you ought to go get that checked." And since she is a nurse, I thought, all right, if she says I need to get it checked, I will. I go to the ENT doctor, and they do a needle biopsy on it. And they say, all right, this isn't cancerous. This is a tumor, though, that will continue to grow until it is removed. They tell me what the surgery is going to entail, which is the removal isn't a lance. They have to, and I'll save your audience the details. It's a pretty evasive 4-hour surgery. If you're familiar, it's called a parotidectomy. And I was going to be on the shelf for about 2 weeks in the house by myself, not being able to be viewed in public because the tubes will be coming out of me and I'll be all mangled up. And then a nice recovery period after that. So I have the surgery in January. Excellent success. The Dr. Sequoia did a fantastic job. He didn't nick any nerves, which is very common in these surgeries. At that time, my biggest concern is I wasn't going to look as pretty as I do today, Daniel, because they were going to mess up some nerves. And there's going to be a divot in my face, which is there today. But then about a week after, I got an email. And this is how broken our medical system is. And it said, "We have a message for you in your client portal." I go in there, and that message told me that I had cancer. Lymphoma, to be specific, and then it had a bunch of fancy words that, of course, I didn't understand. I had to wait 2 weeks before I could get into an oncologist and they could go explain it, and then had to wait about another month for this battery of tests, very evasive tests, but the details don't really matter for this story. What I experienced during that 2-month period, where today I am cancer-free, I'm very, very fortunate. But what I experienced personally during that time period has really changed my framework on how I look at things. When you are faced with the idea of potentially dying, the way you look at what you've done and what you obsess about today completely changes the framework. The great Les Brown, the motivational speaker, used to tell the story of the optimal way to pass away is after living a long, full life to be surrounded in a hospital bed by the people that you love. But behind those people will be the ghosts of the books you didn't write, the trips you didn't go on, the businesses you didn't start. Now, I've heard that story 100 times. And when you're healthy, you think you can rationalize what those ghosts might be. I can tell you when you don't know what the outcomes be, you think it might be the end. Those ghosts, they don't look like Casper the Friendly Ghost. They look like Mike Tyson in his prime, standing across from you in the ring. You know it's already over. The only thing left is the pain. And I use that Mike Tyson example when I share this story now with advisors or frankly anybody who would listen, because when you're faced with that in reality, that Mike Tyson weighs very, very heavy on you. And so what I encourage my advisor clients to do and my friends and everybody I tell the story to is figure out who your Mike Tyson is today while you're healthy, while you can go attack it. Because we know we don't have forever, but until you're faced with it, you don't actually really, you might not be taking the actions that you need to head where you want to head. I appreciate you letting me share the story. The context for that is when it comes to goal setting, most people neglect it. It is, in my experience now, more important than ever that you know what you're building, why you're building it, and make sure you're doing what you want to do.
So do you explicitly sort of cultivate an awareness of death as part of this?
I do now. So my initial plan, I couldn't not tell the story of what happened because there's a dividend and scar on the side of my face now, but I did not anticipate it being a part of the messaging that I put out to clients and folks. After the cancer, after my experience there, it's at the very top of the list. And it's led to some incredible conversations about the importance of focusing on what you want to do, making sure that you're headed in the path that you want to be on because you don't have forever. And what makes that relatable to a lot of folks is, I just turned 50. I'm not that old. When I got my cancer diagnosis, we as an industry, we just lost Gavin. And then of course, Tina Powell over intentionally, she's publicly shared her story and what she's gone through. And luckily she just found out that she's cancer free. And doing that really, I think for people who are serious about improvement and thinking through their life, those types of stories can be impactful.
Yeah, the listeners of the show will know what a big fan I am of this. The psychological term for it is an existential boundary experience, like when you have this real life realization that we're not always going to be here, because this is one of these things we know, but we don't really know it, right? Like it's kind of like the future self in retirement. Like, yeah, you know you're going to retire one day, you're going to need money, and that 80-year-old you wants to, eat and go on vacations too. But like today, that doesn't seem very vivid or very visceral. But you have a cancer scare like you did, or, there's many other flavors of this. You lose someone in your family, whatever. It makes it much more real. So, all kinds of world religions do this. Stoicism, existentialism, lots of philosophical traditions have this idea of sort of cultivating an awareness of your own finitude as a way of catalyzing growth. I'm sitting here looking at my goals. I literally have my little goal sheet here, which I'm very proud to show you. But, one of the things that Carl Richards and Michael Kitces talk about that's really influenced me is, these are my words, not theirs, just how lame some client goals are sometimes. Like the clients will come in with financial goals that are kind of generic, or it's like a round number that they kind of, pulled out of the air. And I think this Mike Tyson example and this idea of making your own impermanence more present in the room is a good way to make those goals a whole lot better.
Right. And so the takeaway question for everybody is, who is your Mike? What is your Mike Tyson?
Yeah. Who is your Mike Tyson? Got it. Okay. We're going to leave the human domain. Sadly for me, we're leaving the human domain. I feel like the stories aren't as good in the technical domain. Maybe I'm But we'll move to the technical domain now, to client communication systems. What are you looking for here in sort of an ideal setup?
Yeah, so this gets kind of nerdy now and not as aspirational or inspirational, I guess. Daniel, I'm saying this because I am on your podcast, but The Behavioral Investor is one of my favorite books in the industry. In fact, I encourage advisors to use it as part of their marketing campaign where they can. But one thing that you say on page 177, and you can see all the dog tags I have in here, is you talk about the common themes in behavioral portfolios, but this applies to an advisor's business as well, is systems trump discretion. And so the more systems you have in your business, the better it's going to be, the simpler it will be, and the more effective you'll be as an advisor. So in these three domains, it's really simple. So you'll know that you have an effective client communication system if you can answer this question quickly. What are your next 4 communication touch points with your number 7 and number 17th largest client? I've asked that to billion-dollar teams. I've asked that to advisors that manage $50 million. Very few people can answer that question. And that is why they struggle on a day-to-day basis. Now, one of my grandiose ideas when I started consulting, Daniel, was that I'm going to build the most technical, sexy client communication tool an advisor would ever want to use. And I built it in Excel so wirehouse advisors could use it as well. And it looked great. It told you what to do, when to do it. We had macros running in the background to optimize everything. And advisors loved it when they saw it. They loved it when it was implemented, but every single one of them failed. And they all failed because they were too complex. So based on an advisor's business, if you build a simple communication system, even if it's as simple as jumping into your Redtail or your client communicate or whatever CRM you're using and scheduling out repeating tasks to make sure you're staying in front of clients, you're doing better than most of the advisors out there. And there's also great tools and resources like Bento Engine or FP Pathfinder that can help you with that communication system. But the idea is to build it simple, but make sure it's in there.
First of all, listeners of this podcast only use Redtail. That's a qualification. No, lots of great stuff out there. So I remember a thing that I don't know if he did the research or if he was sharing someone else's. So my apologies. But Michael Kitces had a piece out years ago, and it was the number of sort of communication touch points needed for basically like a 5-star rating from your clients. And it was 5, right? So like if in-person meeting is 1 and a newsletter is 1 and a podcast is 1, what does a good communication system look like for you? And what is so good about that question? I have my own guesses, but what is so good about that question? The 7 and 17th, that touches on a number of things. If you can answer that, you're getting a number of things right. So break down that question for us and tell us why it's such a powerful question.
Yeah, so this really is just based on experience working with advisors on their communication systems. So prior to working with as many folks as I have today, I just assumed I would hand them a template and every advisor could go execute the same client communication system and it would work. And the reality is it doesn't work that way because every advisor is different, just like every client is different. So when I realized that my super sexy Excel spreadsheet that looked really good was failing, I went out and started researching other systems that were out there, and I just stole from the best. For example, the Supernova system says that you should only have A clients and you should touch them once a month. Well, so part of the framework that we start with a client is touching every A client once a month, and then the advisor decides whether to dial that up or dial that down. But I don't believe that an advisor should only work with A clients. That's not the way the real world works. So you have to account for the proverbial B clients. And what does that touchpoint system look like? And we start with every other month, and they dial that up or they dial that back. And so using that chassis, the advisor can customize how their business works today, how they want it to be in the future to their own business needs.
Is that monthly touch point like an individual personalized piece, or is that like a mass, is that MailChimp sending you your podcast for the month?
It's definitely nothing automated or a birthday touch. So in my super sexy system, I would tell you when you were sending a text message, a personal note, doing a business meeting, when you were doing a client, whatever the touch point was, and that broke. And so what I found is I break touch points into 2 types, a business touch and a social touch. And then you go, when it's time to reach out to that client, you as an advisor decide what type of social touch. Do you take them to lunch? Do you just pick up the phone and call them? Do you send them an email? You make the decision as the advisor based upon where you are in that client relationship. On the business side, if it's time to touch Mr. and Mrs. Jones with a business touch, you decide, what do they want? Do they want a phone call from me? Do they want a Zoom? Do they want an in-person meeting? And that flexibility is what makes this type of system last for the long term.
Okay, next we're going to move to where you thought you were going to start, which is the wealth management system, investments, planning, the like. What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think that I'm one of the only consultants or coaches out there that will go deep on this. And so there is definitely not a templated process, but to talk about it at a high level, you start with a question. And the question goes like this. And this is me asking the financial advisor in a role play. I have $3 million. I was referred to you. We've known each other socially. We've exchanged all the pleasantries. And I say, Daniel, what are you going to do with my money? Because that's how clients actually ask that question, right? And I just listen for their answer. And it usually is a little bit of fumbling around. Well, we're going to want to get all your documents and maybe do a risk profile. And they don't have a concise story. And that's how we know we need to build a story that has 3 parts. Number 1, the advisor's own story on how they serve their clients and why, that is short and concise. Number 2, their investment system needs to be an actual system. So what do your model portfolios look like? I'm not saying advisors need to become portfolio managers. You can outsource it to the great TAMPs that are out there or OCIOs, but it's your system, your process branded to what you do. And then this is where I end up really being able to help advisors is implementing the financial planning process in there. It's amazing how many advisors either don't do financial planning or they do financial planning light. And once they start putting in a systematic way of implementing financial planning with their clients, it's amazing how many additional assets you uncover, planning opportunities, and opportunities to serve.
Yeah, I don't know if we discussed that enough. Financial planning is a good unto itself, right? Like we understand it's valuable all by itself. Let's say you're only in it for the money. I mean, there is a huge opportunity cost to not doing deep dive financial planning. Said another way, there's a huge upside, there's huge business upside to doing financial planning that I think sometimes we don't talk about because we're talking about planning in such sort of reverent terms. There's really a lot of good it does in many ways.
Oh, I think there's a lot of imposter syndrome too in the advisor community around planning, even amongst CFPs, if you can believe that, but especially folks that aren't credentialed. They know they need to do it. They might be doing some type of planning light, but they don't want to get asked questions that they can't answer. And that just leads to potentially bad client outcomes. And that's why it's so important. And the one thing around this that I've found interesting is I always ask advisors after we've gotten into the relationship a little bit, if they'd like me to take a look at their financial plan to make sure they're on track. How many do you think over my 10 years of doing this actually have a financial plan?
A fraction.
One advisor said, oh yeah, I have a plan here, Jay. Yeah, what do you think? So that's led for opportunities for me to help advisors build their own plan, make sure that they're on track. Of course, somewhat nothing to do with it. Others like the idea of doing it inside of my house because then, their employees and other advisors don't see what their financial plan looks like. But it's just incredibly important. And then what's the old saying, Daniel? The cobbler's children have no shoes.
Yeah. I'm on a soapbox about advisors having advisors, right? And I mean, it's a related soapbox because, so many people who are enthusiastic about the work that I do kind of lead with the value of behavioral coaching when it comes to, the world of investment management and financial planning, but then they don't have their own behavioral coaches, right? And it's like, look, if a client comes to you and says, hey, why don't I just 60-40 Vanguard this thing myself and not pay you? What do? Right? And you tell them, there's all these other things that we do, and a big part of it's behavioral. Well, your ability to manage your own portfolio still says nothing about your ability to manage your own behavior. And just because you have the technical know-how to construct a nicely put together asset allocation doesn't mean anything about the rest of your financial life. So I do believe we need to give our kids some shoes in this industry. I think there's a lot of kids running around without shoes in our world.
Well, so to put a bow on that, when you came on my podcast years ago, when it was just an audio podcast, in fact, I think I called you on your phone, and that's how we did that show. It was so long ago. We talked about this very idea, and that actually started my thinking around helping advisors with their own financial plan, because advisors do need advisors. You were a pioneer in that logic.
Hey, I'm just trying to get everyone paid and everyone taken care of. Last piece, business development system, client-focused marketing and sales. Talk to us about the business systems that need to be in place, and where do you see sort of the most glaring deficiencies with this?
Yeah, so typically if an advisor's reaching out to discuss an engagement, they think they have one of two pain points. They're overwhelmed by their business and they want to know, some best practices, and that really gets into optimizing their client communication system. But more often than not, they see some nonsense that I have on social media somewhere, and they say, I want to have a social media footprint like Jay has. Let's talk to him about how we're going to do this. And that's the last thing that they need. So when we talk about business development for an advisor or for a firm, I try and put it in 3 buckets. So we have a client-focused bucket, a marketing bucket, and a sales bucket. Most people don't like to talk about the sales bucket because they don't want to see themselves as salespeople. But ideally, or usually, when somebody reaches out, they have an established business, and most of the new business they need is already inside their existing book of business. If they took care of who they have, they will end up with more referrals, more introductions, and they don't have a system in place to make sure that happens. So we start with a simple question. I say, hey, who are the last couple of referrals that you had to centers of influence, and how often have you followed up with them? Of course, the answer is, I can't remember, I haven't been following up with them. So we know they don't have a systematic way of doing that. So then we lean back into that client communication system. That in turn usually ends up generating more business than what they would need. Now, that doesn't mean that marketing and sales are not important. There are some great platforms out there today that can help you with any type of marketing systems that you have. It's actually not that complex, whether it is FMG Suite or the folks over at Snappy Kraken, which integrate really well with Redtail and Orion. You can go and get the marketing systems that you need as a financial advisor to augment what you're doing. But then the last one, sales, nobody wants to talk about. And I typically will ask something to the effect of, hey, what is your sales funnel on your website? What is the journey that somebody goes through if they're thinking about doing business with you? And they don't have it. So that's when we then try to go deep on what exactly the client journey looks like if somebody is considering doing business with the advisor.
A theme that runs from the human part to the technical part of what you're talking about is oftentimes the places people want to start is not the place people need to start, right? They want to start with the sexy stuff, like, let's get me famous, like, let's get a viral tweet. And the place you need to start is like, let's get you taking care of the people you have. I forget the source, my apologies, but there's a slide in one of our presentations that talks about the difference in referrals given between moderately satisfied and like extremely satisfied clients. And moderately satisfied clients give like a referral a decade, and extremely satisfied clients give like 10 a year or something like this. I mean, it's just incredible the kind of value that can be found in taking incredible care of the people that already have trusted you with their business.
100%. In fact, most of the $1 million plus revenue producing advisors that reach out to me, they end up not even implementing marketing and sales systems because they realized they weren't taking care of their existing clients, and that once they started doing that, they're busy. They don't have time for the other stuff.
Have you given us a magic question for this one? I'm finding that you have your magic questions for sort of each of your pillars here. Is there a magic question here?
Yeah. Tell me the last 2 centers of influence that were introduced to you and how often you communicate with them.
I like these questions. It's a beautiful sort of simple gut check to just sort of see how you're doing. I won't lie to you. My favorite is the 7 and the 17th. That's like so delightfully random, but it tells you, how well are you taking care of your folks? How well do you know them? I think that's a brilliant question. Well, Jay, we're very glad that you're at full speed now. We're very glad that your scare is over and that it's pushing you to do bigger and better things and to push the people you work with. If people want to learn more about the various resilient companies, where can people find you and where can they learn more about what you do?
Well, most applicable to this audience is simply resilientadvisor.com.
Thank you so much. Look forward to eating some fried food in the dirty South when I get back from my trip out west this summer.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me on, Dane.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.